We began the Sargent season with an inspiring talk by Richard Ormond, curator of John Singer Sargent, Portraits in Charcoal, an esteemed Sargent specialist, Sargent descendant. Richard is was the great nephew of the artist, and an authority on all things Sargent. Now, while the exhibition continues at the Morgan until January the 12th, 2020, next year, our second and final lecture related to the exhibition is by no less a formidable authority, who is a preeminent historian of 19th and 20th century Britain and its empire, and whose scholarly and professional interests relate to many of the central themes in the exhibition. It's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Sir David Cannadine to the Morgan Library and Museum. Since 2008, David has been Dodge Professor of History at Princeton University, having previously taught at the Universities of Cambridge, Columbia, and London. His professional service extends far beyond the university walls. He is currently President of the British Academy, General Editor of the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, and as he informs me, the third half of his time is spent writing a history of the Ford Foundation. He appears regularly as a commentator on radio and television, and is a historian who is committed also to the intersection of art and history. And perhaps nowhere is this seen better than in his various roles as trustee, vice chair, and chair of the National Portrait Gallery in London, with whom we are collaborating next year on an exhibition devoted to David Hockney's portraits. In 2009, David was knighted for his services to scholarship. David Cannadine is the author of 20 books, his most recent being Victorian Century, the United Kingdom, 1808 to 1906, and on the eve of Brexit, what a formidable evening we have ahead of us. He has also edited at least 14 volumes, including a recently published History of Westminster Abbey. Other works include the award-winning Decline and Fall of the British Aristocracy, published in 1990, which I remember devouring that book, and Aspects of Aristocracy, Grandeur and Decline in Modern Britain, published by Yale in 1994. In these books, Cannadine sheds light on the shifting class structures and economic and social structures in late 19th and early 20th century Britain. This shift of class and power impacted many of the figures portrayed by Sargent, who included new American multimillionaires, increasingly on the ascendant, as well as the British aristocrats, whose power had started to wane. In his lecture tonight, British Aristocrats and American Plutocrats in the Age of Sargent, David Cannadine will explore the interconnected transatlantic world of those groups and will investigate why Sargent was the man they wanted to paint and draw their portraits. We will not be having questions from the podium afterwards, but at the end of the lecture, David is kind enough will be outside of the auditorium, and if you have books to sign or questions to ask, you can do so then. Please join me in welcoming Sir David Cannadine to the podium.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Colin, thank you so much for that exceptionally kind and generous introduction. Since I spend quite a large part of my time speaking as well as writing, I have become an unrivaled connoisseur of introductions to myself, which is not, it must be said, a fiercely competed for position. And I recall that on one occasion when I was on the road with my Life of Andrew Mellon, I was in Kansas City, and there was a rather grand dinner put on, which was rather splendid. And then the person who presided at the dinner led me to the lecture hall and introduced me. And he began by saying, I should like to introduce Professor David Cannadine. He is the author of the greatest biography of Andrew Mellon ever written. And I rather preened myself at this point and thought the evening promised well. He then rather spoilt the effect by adding, it is, of course, the only biography of Andrew. So, Colin, thank you so much for not having said that. It's a huge pleasure to be here in this glorious treasure house, one of the great, outstanding cultural institutions of which this city has many, but there's none quite as special and splendid as this one. And it's a huge pleasure to be here to have a chance to talk about Sargent in homage to him and in homage to this really rather wonderful exhibition that I've just had the chance to go round. Sargent was the last in a line of great painters of the British aristocracy, which extended back across the centuries via Lawrence, Gainsborough, and Reynolds to Van Dyck. In the high society portraits of the 1890s and early 1900s, Sargent constantly borrowed from and alluded to these earlier artists, deliberately presenting himself and his subjects as the upholders and embellishers of a great and of a continuing tradition. He painted men who thought themselves to be of consequence and position: Lord Dalhousie, Lord Ribblesdale, the Marquis of Londonderry, and Arthur Baltha. He immortalized a succession of beautiful patrician women, among them the Wyndham sisters, the Duchess of Portland, the Duchess of Devonshire, and the Duchess of Sutherland, and he produced bravura family portraits of the Sitwells and of the Marlboroughs, which by turn capture both the domestic security and the public swagger of the Edwardian aristocracy in full bloom and abundant flower. Set against backgrounds of colonnaded opulence or monumental luxury, Sargent's subjects appear to be the very embodiment of effortless poise, noble assurance, and patrician hauteur. With their splendid uniforms, their billowing robes, their elaborate dresses, their glittering jewels, and their abundant orders and decorations. He painted the late Victorian and Edwardian aristocracy as they liked to see themselves and as they wished to be remembered, as the worthy successors to their great ancestors. Small wonder Sargent was so sought after as, in Rodin's words, the Van Dyck of our times. Beyond question, this is part of the truth about Sargent, about the British aristocracy, and about the magnificent portraits he painted of them. But what makes Sargent so interesting, it seems to me, as a historian contemplating him as an artist, is that it's far from being the whole truth. For he did more, or alternatively, depending on your point of view, he did less than reinforce the aristocratic world's good opinion of itself. On closer inspection, many of his superior sitters appear unsure of themselves, detached from their backgrounds, haunted by long and lurking shadows, overwhelmed by their ostentatious apparel, and gazing out with a controlled intensity which betrays an inner anxiety that no amount of external self-assurance, which the aristocracy have always been rather good at, can conceal. And they often had good cause to be thus concerned, for the age of Sargent was also an age of aristocratic anxiety and uncertainty. For all his seemingly disdainful hauteur, Lord Ribblesdale was never more than a minor politician whose peerage died with him and whose only real claim to fame was that Sargent had painted him. Arthur Baltha may have been the inevitable successor to his uncle, the third Marquis of Salisbury, as Great Britain's Conservative Prime Minister in 1902, but he presided over a weak and divided administration. He lost 3 general elections, and Lloyd George said that Arthur Balfour's place in history would be no more than the whiff of fading perfume on a pocket handkerchief. Far from enjoying a happy home, the Sitwell children suffered greatly at their parents' hands, which left Osbert, Sacheverell, and Edith scarred for life in many different ways. And that extraordinary, grandiose bravura Marlborough portrait, still in the Grand Saloon at Blenheim Palace, was in some ways pure fantasy. The family were in fact impoverished and blighted by scandal. The Duke had married the American heiress Consuelo Vanderbilt for her money, because he needed to fix the roof at Blenheim, and Blenheim has a very big roof. She hated Blenheim, and they eventually divorced. Well, from this perspective, Sargent was not just an aristocratic illusionist whose marbled backgrounds and flowing brushwork conveyed a powerful impression of certainty, happiness, confidence, and serenity. He was also, at the same time, a perceptive observer of an elite increasingly beset by doubts and difficulties, yet which was determined to try to keep up appearances. Nor is this the only evidence his work provided that all was not well with the British aristocracy in the age of Sargent. Unlike Van Dyck or Reynolds or Gainsborough or Lawrence, many of his subjects, as of course the exhibition here makes plain, were not British notables,
but they were Jews or Americans, actors or plutocrats, businessmen or professionals, members of a new global cosmopolitan elite which was threatening to supersede the old British territorially rooted elite. And of course, she, Mrs. Morgan, is a classic instance of that broader repertoire of painting which Sargent practiced. In other words, Sargent's aristocratic portraits, whether in oils or in charcoal, were but one part of a much larger oeuvre which recognized the advent of a wider, less stable, more complex world which had not existed in the days of Van Dyck or Lawrence. For during the 1880s and 1890s and on into the Edwardian era, the British aristocracy was obliged to confront the prospect and the possibility that the writing might be on the wall, at least for some of them, if not necessarily for all of them. The fact that Sargent was the last upholder of the great tradition of patrician portraiture both denies yet corroborates this anxious mood. After him, great painters turned their back on portraits of the aristocracy, and after him, the British aristocracy was never so confident again. And it's not at all coincidence that those developments occurred simultaneously. Well, this sunset story, as I propose to call it, begins as the last quarter of the 19th century dawned, when, so it seemed, the aristocracy and gentry of Great Britain continued unchallenged in their traditional preeminence. They still formed the wealth elite and the territorial elite of the country. Despite the disruptive changes associated with the Industrial Revolution, great superpowers like the Buccleuchs, the Sutherlands, and the Devonshires remained the richest men in the kingdom, measuring their estates in hundreds of thousands of acres and their incomes in hundreds of thousands of pounds. When one Duke of Sutherland passed on, a contemporary observed, "He was a leviathan of wealth. I do believe he was the richest man who ever died." At that time, 1/4 of the land of England and Wales was owned by scarcely 700 individuals, and 4/5 of the whole of the British Isles was held by a mere 7,000 landed families. And not surprisingly, they not only owned it, but they governed it as well. Even after the Parliamentary Reform Acts of 1832 and 1867, the aristocracy took it for granted that they should rule the nation as of right, and most other people took that for granted as well. Until the early 1880s, the majority of MPs were still landowners or their relatives. Peerages were only given out to those who owned substantial estates, and all cabinets, whether Liberal or Tory, were dominated by patricians. Illustrious dynasties like the Derbys, the Devonshires, the Bedfords, and the Salisburys were regarded as the great governing families of the realm. Well, in that pre-Sargent era, the men and women who made up Britain's traditional aristocratic and landowning elite possessed a very strong sense of confident, collective, corporate identity. They knew they were the lords of the earth. After all, they owned it. They knew they were the makers of history, the stars of the firmament, God's elect. As Benjamin Disraeli put it, this was a time when the world belonged to the few, and above all, to the very few. But it was not to do so for much longer. By the end of the 19th century, the foundations of aristocratic dominance were under considerable pressure and strain. And in the years before the First World War, the years when Sargent was doing his portraits, fears for the future increased rather than abated. It was against this shifting, uncertain background that Sargent painted and drew his high society portraits, in which he provided reassurance, but not quite enough of it. For the particular patrician anxieties which his pictures simultaneously denied yet recognized were merely individual instances of a broader and more pervasive aristocratic malaise. And in the aftermath of the age of Sargent, that malaise intensified. Today, some aristocrats may still live in Britain in great houses, but they are no longer a self-confident elite. They are no longer the wealth elite, they are no longer the status elite, and they are no longer the power elite. And if you don't believe me, check in with Boris Johnson and above all with Jeremy Corbyn. That change is one of the greatest in modern British history. How did it come about, and why did it seem to begin in the age of Sargent? A significant part of the answer lies in the eventual triumph of the masses over the classes. There were several aspects to this confrontation, and it took place throughout Britain beginning in the 1880s. In Ireland, the conflict was most pronounced, where there was a widespread rejection of Protestant, aristocratic British landlordism by organised militant Catholic nationalists. Tenants refused to pay their rents, landowners were subjected to violent intimidation, and after this bitterly fought land war, the Protestant ascendancy was never the same again, and in the late 1910s and early 1920s, many of the remaining great houses were burnt down. In some parts of Scotland and Wales, again in the 1880s, there were similar agitations by tenants and crofters, resenting, no longer respecting, the huge amount of power and influence and broad acres which landowners still possessed. During the same decade, the passing of the Third Reform Act in the middle of the 1880s greatly extended the political franchise and brought the representational structure of the United Kingdom more into line with the changing economic and social realities of what had been going on over the last 100 years. Britain was irreversibly becoming an urban democracy. Politics became more concerned with class issues, and a new breed of politician, hostile to the aristocracy, came to the fore. Not for nothing did the great Lord Salisbury describe the 1880s as a decade of what he called disintegration. One of these new-style thrusting politicians who made hostility to the aristocracy an essential part of his political platform and program was Joseph Chamberlain, a radical Birmingham industrialist who in the late 1870s and early 1880s likened the nobility, the British nobility, to the lilies of the field, idle parasites who toil not, neither do they spin. This did not go down well in the country houses across the land, and it was a portent of further trouble to come. A generation later, a man widely denounced by the aristocracy as a damned Welsh attorney, namely David Lloyd George, preached the language of class war as never before in violent and memorable and mocking words. Aristocracy, he remarked on one occasion, is like cheese. The older it gets, the higher it becomes. In another speech, he likened the House of Lords to 500 men chosen randomly from among the ranks of the unemployed. They really didn't like that. By his demagoguery, his indignant passion, and his unrivaled gift for memorable words and mocking phrases, Lloyd George did more than anyone to undermine and discredit the aristocracy's continuing claim to admiration, deference, and respect. And as a result of the particular episode in which Lloyd George produced these memorable one-liners, the result of that was the passing of the Parliament Act in 1911, which abolished the House of Lords' historic powers of veto over any legislation coming up from the more democratically elected House of Commons, perhaps the single most important event in what we might want to call the decline of the British aristocracy. By 1914, then, the old elite thus found itself increasingly embattled. Aristocracy and democracy did not comfortably coexist. Then came the First World War, initially greeted with rapturous enthusiasm by young notables who were eager to volunteer and join up. Here was the supreme challenge and the supreme chance for the much-maligned aristocracy to justify its continued existence. By temperament, by training, and by tradition, they formed the warrior class, fearlessly leading their men into battle. Well, they fearlessly led their men into battle in the First World War on the Western Front, and they paid a mortally high price for doing so in the trenches. Julian and Billy Grenfell were but two of a whole host of gilded patrician youths who perished in the blood of Flanders. Hugo and Ivo Charteris were two more, the sons of Lady Elcho, one of the three Wyndham sisters of Sargent's portrait. And one of those figures is, of course, in the exhibition upstairs. Nor were those losses exceptional. Of the great Lord Salisbury's 10 grandsons, 5 were killed in action. Here was disintegration on a new and nightmarish and horrifying scale. Beyond doubt, that patrician holocaust, for such in demographic terms it was, did much further to undermine the aristocracy's confidence in itself and greatly weakened its desire to rule. And the passing of the Fourth Reform Act in 1918, which finally brought something close to adult suffrage and democracy in Britain, did much to undermine its capacity to rule as well. From the late 1870s onwards then, many landowners also found that their wealth was becoming less Himalayan and less secure than it had been in their mid-Victorian heyday. The late 19th century witnessed the first modern agricultural depression, as prices in Britain plummeted with the influx of grain from the prairies of the United States and Canada, and of lamb and beef from the Antipodes and Argentina. As a result, farmers' profits in the United Kingdom were severely hit, and the rentals they paid to their landlords had to be reduced by as much as a third, if not more. Many landowners, encumbered by debts and mortgages which their forebears had accumulated in earlier generations when it seemed as though agriculture would continue to keep prospering, and faced by sudden reductions in their income, found themselves increasingly unable to make ends meet, as British agriculture continued in that depressed condition until the Second World War and far beyond. And that was not the only challenge to what had previously been the secure, unthreatened financial position of aristocratic landowners. For at the same time that their wealth was in many senses being undermined and eroded, it also saw, the late 19th century, a spectacular explosion of massive new plutocratic fortunes, which began not only to rival, but to overwhelm all but the greatest aristocratic accumulations. Men like Cowdray, Lever, Guinness, and Northcliffe in Britain, men like Rhodes and Werner and Bight and Bonato in South Africa, and above all, of course, men like Mellon and Astor and Rockefeller and Frick and Morgan here in the United States. Many of them, of course, Sargent's clients. To make matters worse, British governments now began to tax landowners as never before. Death duties were first introduced in 1894, initially at a relatively modest rate, but thereafter they were inexorably increased, and by the 1930s they stood at 60% on the largest estates. Well, the result of all that was that at the same time that the aristocracy was facing political challenge and a certain degree of demographic disaster during the First World War, land itself became less attractive or secure as a means of holding wealth. As Oscar Wilde makes Lady Bracknell say in The Importance of Being Earnest, land has ceased to be either a privilege or a pleasure. It gives one position, but prevents one from keeping it up. That's all that can be said about land. That being so, many owners either decided or were compelled to dispose of some or all of their broad historic acres. In Ireland, a succession of land acts, that's to say legislation put through by the government, enabled landowners to sell out on reasonably advantageous terms between 1885 and 1914, so that by the time the Republic of Ireland was established in 1922, independent Ireland, most of the great landed estates in that part of Ireland, the majority of Ireland, had simply disappeared. In Wales, Scotland, and England, there were massive sales in the years immediately before and immediately after the First World War, amounting to what was termed by contemporaries at the time a revolution in landholding, the like of which had not been seen since the Norman conquest or the dissolution of the monasteries. It was a revolution. At the same time, many of the greatest grandees' London palaces, Grosvenor House, Devonshire House, Lansdowne House, were either sold off to the new rich or demolished, and hotels or apartment houses were built instead. And from the 1880s onwards, the disposal of great works of art to the new rich here in America, think of this place, think of the Frick as classic examples of that, became an increasingly familiar phenomenon, beginning with the Duke of Marlborough's sales of many of the best Lenin paintings in the 1880s, and culminating in the Duke of Westminster's sale of the Blue Boy to Edward Huntington of California shortly after the end of the First World War, prompting one of Cole Porter's earliest songs, appropriately called the Blue Boy Blues. The British aristocracy, hitherto the great accumulators of works of art, town and country houses and broad-acred estates, were becoming instead the great dispersers. And in much of that process of dispersal and dissolution, the new rich of America bought things up. Inevitably, those multifarious developments also weakened the aristocracy's local position as the elite which had for centuries represented and ruled the counties of Great Britain, both as members of Parliament and as justices of the peace. The much larger and relatively independent electorate that was created by the Third and Fourth Reform Acts, combined with patrician impoverishment and territorial decline, meant that fewer landowners were standing for the House of Commons, and fewer still were getting themselves elected. With rare exceptions, the deferential policies of Trollope's Barset had largely come to an end. By the First World War, even the majority of county seats, those rural constituencies where younger sons of aristocrats and the country gentry had expected almost as of right to get elected, were being represented by people of different social backgrounds. Well, as the notables gradually surrendered their roles as governors and representatives in the localities, it inevitably followed that they were also ceasing to be governors and representatives of the country as a whole. In Parliament, as in the shires, the writing was on the wall. At the general election of 1885, the first House of Commons ever was returned, where the landowners, the aristocracy and gentry, were no longer a majority of MPs. And that anti-territorial trend intensified so that by the 1930s, scarcely 10% of MPs could claim authentically patrician lineage. And a similar transformation took place in the upper house. From the 1880s onwards, peerages were increasingly being given out for the first time on a large scale to the non-landed rich, to civil servants and soldiers, and to MPs from business and professional backgrounds. Previously, the House of Lords had been the exclusive bastion of territorial nobility, but it was becoming increasingly a place to which people from many different walks of life might aspire, especially if they were very rich, something I'll return to in a moment. Those changes, in turn, of course, affected in the composition of the Commons and the Lords, led to parallel changes in the higher echelons of government. Up until Lord Salisbury in the 1880s and 90s, most British cabinets were overwhelmingly dominated by the aristocracy and by the gentry. But by the time the Liberals took office, late in 1905, landowners had ceased to be in the majority, and they had never been in the majority again, except for the brief exception of Bonar Law's government in 1922-3. And the same was true of prime ministers as well. Neither Asquith nor Lloyd George were people who came from aristocratic backgrounds, quite the contrary. Ramsay MacDonald, the first Labour Prime Minister, was lowly born and illegitimate, while the three Tory Prime Ministers, Bonar Law himself, Stanley Baldwin and Neville Chamberlain, were all businessmen. This is a completely different array of occupations from the grandees, the landowners, the gentry, who had previously monopolised the position of Prime Minister. As the old elite declined in these varied, interrelated, and of course self-reinforcing ways, there were protests by some of its more high-minded or resentful members that the traditional standards of public life were slipping as the parvenus and the plutocrats took over. One sign of this was that from the 1880s onwards, knighthoods and peerages were increasingly given out in far greater numbers than ever before, and were increasingly given out to people of more varied and often more humble social origins. For example, and as its name implies, the Order of Merit, instituted by Edward VII, was awarded for excellence and achievement regardless of ancestry or acres. And merit and aristocracy don't cohabit easily. By the same token, the Order of the British Empire, set up in 1917, was deliberately designed to be democratic rather than exclusive in its multi-layered membership. And I have never forgotten an observation made to me when I received my knighthood, half in jest, I think, by a very Grand Duchess, but half, I think, not in jest at all, and relating to the point I've just made, when she said to me, "I fear, David, that your book on the decline and fall of the British aristocracy must have some truth in it, now that people like you are getting titles." I don't propose to tell you who she was, or indeed is. At the same time, both the Liberals and Conservatives began to reward generous benefactors to their party funds as electioneering became more expensive, as there was a bigger franchise and you had to work harder for the vote. They began to reward generous benefactors to their party funds with peerages, which gave rise to justified but disputed charges of corruption. Nothing's changed there. That still goes on to this day. This practice reached its apogee, or its nadir, during the premiership of Lloyd George, the lifelong enemy of the aristocracy, Prime Minister from 1916 to 22, when titles were openly hawked about London clubs and were bought and sold for cash according to a recognised tariff
and were, in the words of one very grand authentic peer, being sold across the counter like packets of tea. Therefore, thereafter, the honour system was cleaned up a bit, but the old ethos of patrician exclusiveness and disinterested decency was irrevocably undermined. Equally threatened and equally vulnerable was the general social pattern of aristocratic and genteel living. In London high society, the old patrician monopoly was broken as the new super-rich landlords like Sir Julius Werner and Sir Ernest Cassel flaunted their parvenu wealth and enjoyed the friendship and encouragement of Edward VII, who as a result was known in certain scurrilous quarters as the King of the Jews. By the interwar years, after the sale and demolition of their great town palaces, the aristocracy had all but abandoned large-scale London entertaining, and what was left of metropolitan society was led by people widely regarded again by the traditional aristocracy as socially ambitious American adventurers like Henry Channon, Emerald Cunard, and of course Wallace Simpson. In the shires and the countryside, the picture was essentially the same. Instead of being, as before, a patrician preserve, it was increasingly becoming a plutocratic playground, with country house weekends and lavish shooting parties at which thousands of birds were slaughtered in unconscious anticipation of the human carnage that was to come in 1914. Impoverished landowners were forced to withdraw from country life by letting or selling their houses. The new rich bought or rented them, but were part-time visitors rather than full-time residents with a sense of territorial specificity. Between them, the motor car, the shotgun, and the barbed wire dealt heavy blows to traditional country living. And the land sales before and after the First World War further undermined the territorial basis of the old county communities. As the old guard withdrew from the London season and from country society, they spent more time than ever before overseas, as what remained of the leisure class became increasingly the pleasure class. Some of them holidayed on the Riviera, bought villas in the Mediterranean, or wintered in Egypt. That's why Lord Carnarvon ends up in Egypt and gets involved in the excavation of Tutankhamun's tomb. Some of them bought yachts and sailed them further afield. You'll all remember, I'm sure, that scene in Noel Coward's Private Lives where Elliot and Amanda are on a balcony overlooking the Mediterranean, and one of them says to the other, "Whose yacht is that?" And the other one replies, "The Duke of Westminster's, I suppose. It always is." Some went big game hunting in the United States, India, or East Africa. Some were obliged to leave home because of financial embarrassment or sexual misdemeanor, like Lord Arthur Somerset in the aftermath of the Cleveland Street scandal, or Lord Beauchamp because of his alleged homosexuality. On being told of that particular episode, George V replied, "I thought men like that shot themselves." Some, like Wilfrid Scarron Blunt or Aubrey Herbert, took refuge from the much-disliked travails of modern urban industrial democratic life by going on knight-errantly quests to the Middle East, where they fell in love with what they believed to be the atavistic, uncorrupted splendors of Arab civilization. For whatever reason, these notables were in motion as never before, restless, ruthless, resentful, and in some ways, I think, fragmenting. Well, how then, in the era of John Singer Sargent, did these increasingly beleaguered patricians react to this unmistakable evidence of their own decline and that of their class? One response was to try to augment their dwindling fortunes by making or finding much-needed money elsewhere. Some decided to earn their livings and became in the process labouring aristocrats, itself, of course, rather a contradiction in terms. The Honourable C.S. Rolls, son of the Monmouthshire landowner Lord Langattock, sold high-class cars to high-class people before being killed in the first flying accident ever to take place in Britain. Lord Rayleigh, an Essex landowner, became Professor of Physics at Cambridge University and also went into the milk business. Lord Montague of Bewley founded and edited the motoring magazine Car Illustrated. Some increasingly marginal patricians, like the Countess of Warwick and the Earl of Rosslyn, wrote mildly salacious memoirs in the hope of keeping their creditors at bay. Others, like Osbert Sitwell, Nancy Mitford, and Vita Sackville-West, turned to serious fiction. And of course, a lot of them, like Lord Curzon, the Duke of Manchester, the Duke of Marlborough, already mentioned, and Lord Randolph Churchill, sought out American heiresses, not always happily. There is, of course, a portrait drawing of Lady Randolph upstairs. And dare I mention a name that I was hoping not to have to mention in this lecture, but you will, of course, all remember, if you are devotees of Downton Abbey, that the Chatelaine, the Countess of Grantham, is, of course, an American heiress whose money keeps the whole show on the road.
Among more adventurous and more needy notables in the age of Sargent, the City of London beckoned alluringly as a possible way of restoring family fortunes. But it was a very high-risk undertaking for the ignorant and unstreet-wise, as many British aristocrats were. Some of them allowed their names to be used as guinea pig directors by unscrupulous company promoters. You will, I'm sure, remember that in The Gondoliers, first produced in 1889, W.S. Gilbert satirized such unhappy figures in his creation of the Duke of Plaza Toro, ostensibly a Spanish grandee, but recognizably, in fact, an impoverished British nobleman of the day who tries to raise money by floating himself as a public company. And you will, I'm sure, remember there's one particular song with the following lines. In short, if you'd kindle the spark of a swindle, lure simpletons into your clutches, or hoodwink a debtor, you cannot do better than trot out a duke or a duchess. And a decade later, exactly a decade later, reality afforded a similar example in the person of the Marquis of Dufferin and Arva, an impoverished Irish landowner who, after a lifetime's distinguished service overseas, he really couldn't afford to live at home, as an ambassador and as Governor-General of Canada and Viceroy of India, retired and sought to augment his limited landed income by becoming chairman of a company run by the shady financier Whittaker Wright. It collapsed soon after, and so did Dufferin's own finances, health, and reputation. It was very, very high-risk stuff. Even more adventurous were those gentlemen emigrants who settled in far-off places, usually but not always in the English-speaking world and the British Empire. During the 1880s, it became quite the fashion for young bloods like Lord Lonsdale and Lord Aylesford to go cattle ranching in Texas. They normally returned home poorer and not much wiser. A decade later, several of the more disreputable members of the aristocracy attached themselves to Cecil Rhodes. They invested in his British South Africa Company. Some of them became directors. They took large concessions of land in Rhodesia, and they were later involved in the Boer War. But it was the White Highlands of Kenya which saw the most sustained and systematic attempt to transplant British country house life, threatened in Britain itself, to the empire where it might have a longer life expectancy during the interwar years. Some were serious figures like Lord Francis Scott, a son of the Duke of Buccleuch, and were determined to do their best to build up the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. But many were unscrupulous, amoral, déclassé misfits, like Lord Errol or Sir Delvis Bruton, whose notorious misdoings and misdemeanors in Happy Valley, as it was called, and at the Mutega Club, which was the headquarters of this group of people, have been so vividly described by James Fox in White Mischief. It was said that the appeal of the White Highlands to people like that were 3 A's, altitude, alcohol, and adultery. And that was only the first letter of the alphabet. Well, what does all this add up to? By the time the Second World War broke out in 1939, the age of Sargent was long over, but those trends towards aristocratic perturbation, which, if one looks at them carefully, both his paintings and his charcoal pictures actually show, had intensified more than was the case when he was at his peak. As a result, by 1939, the condition was very different, and from their perspective, even worse and more worrying than it had been back in the 1890s and the 1900s. Of course, the aristocracy had not disappeared altogether. They still haven't disappeared altogether today. But as many interwar memoirs or novels make plain, the aristocracy was well aware, and rightly aware, that they were no longer God's elect. The lords of the earth were becoming strangers in their own land as they sold so much of it off. The makers of history had become the victims of history, with people like Lloyd George and Joseph Chamberlain ganging up against them. And the stars of the firmament no longer shone with unrivaled brilliance because they couldn't afford it or because they were tainted by scandal. Small wonder, then, that during the 1920s and the 1930s, there was no successor to John Singer Sargent, either in terms of these extraordinary bravura portraits, especially of the aristocracy, or in terms of those charcoal drawings that are so brilliantly displayed here. Only Philip de Laszlo and Sir Oswald Burley, whose formulaic paintings capture neither the traditional confidence nor the growing anxiety of the earlier patrician generation, which Sargent depicted, I think, more brilliantly than any of the people who commissioned him ever quite fully understood. And suppose we fast forward still further. Suppose we fast forward to the second half of the 20th century, way after the age of Sargent, where we might perhaps want to advance the proposition that the most significant British portrait painter in the second half of the 20th century was probably Lucian Freud. Well, what a contrast his work presents, both artistically and sociologically, to that of Sargent. There are no or hardly any grandees or plutocrats in Lucian Freud's paintings, only ordinary men and women. And the men are no longer clad in swaggering uniforms, and the women are no longer clad in extraordinary ball gowns glittering with jewels. Most of the time, they haven't got any clothes on at all, and they often reveal mountains of flesh. As far as I know, the only patrician people that Lucian Freud painted were the Duke and Duchess of Devonshire, and in deference to them and to him, they were painted with their clothes on. But there's nothing in those portraits of Andrew and Deborah Devonshire to mark them out as great aristocrats or even as aristocrats at all. So my conclusion is that the world that Sargent depicted in early stages of dissolution has, in many, many ways, long since gone. And it only now exists in the episodes of Downton Abbey. On the other hand, it's worth noticing that one of the pictures, one of the portraits, the charcoal drawings in the exhibition upstairs is of Daisy Fellows. And Julian Fellows is a relative of Daisy Fellows. I wonder what John Singer Sargent would have made of that. Thank you. Thank you.